battlefield of World War I is filled with tales of heroism, but many of the most extraordinary stories have been lost to history. Imagine soldiers whose names you've never heard, whose sacrifices were overshadowed by the giants of war, yet their actions were pivotal in shaping the outcome of one of the deadliest conflicts the world has ever seen. Who were these unsung heroes, and how did they change the course of history? These are the stories you're about to uncover. Get ready to journey into the shadows of history, where the quiet bravery of the forgotten few left an indelible mark on the world. Before we dive in, don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe, and share this video with friends who love history. Let's keep these forgotten heroes alive together. World War I, the Great War. It's a phrase we hear often, but how many of us really grasp the scope of its impact? The war that raged across Europe from 1914 to 1918 wasn't just a battle of soldiers. It was a clash of ideologies, of empires crumbling, of entire generations lost. In many ways, it reshaped the world. Yet, amidst all the focus on famous generals, battles, and nations, the stories of countless men and women who fought on the front lines or behind the scenes remain shrouded in shadow. Do you know the names of the soldiers who won the war? You've probably heard of the likes of General Pershing or perhaps the legendary Red Baron. But what about those whose contributions were just as critical, though they may not have received the fame? What about the ordinary soldiers who showed extraordinary bravery? The ones whose names didn't make the history books, but whose actions were no less heroic. Let's take a step back. World War I wasn't just a fight of armies, it was a fight of nations, ideologies, and resources. It involved more than 30 countries and over 70 million military personnel. Imagine the scale of that. Trenches stretching for miles, soldiers barely surviving in the mud and blood, and above all, the constant fight for survival. But it's easy to overlook the voices of the forgotten, the people who were often not part of the official narratives, but were integral to the war effort. You might think of World War I as just a battle between the Allies and the Central Powers. But there was so much more beneath the surface stories that never made the headlines. What happened to the soldiers from far-off colonies who fought in a war that wasn't theirs, yet their sacrifices were essential? What about the women who left their homes, crossed into the front lines, and played pivotal roles? Or the medics who put their lives on the line, saving countless men even as bullets flew overhead? These forgotten heroes aren't just footnotes in the grand scheme of history, they were change makers. They played pivotal roles that, without them, the war could have gone very differently. Without the contributions of these unsung heroes, the victory we celebrate today might have been out of reach. But why are these stories forgotten? How is it that in the grand narrative of the war, so many of these names and faces were left behind? Could it be that their actions, though extraordinary, weren't seen as important by the powers that be? Or perhaps the stories were too quiet, too subtle, too personal to capture the attention of history's chroniclers? What we're going to explore in the following chapters is just that, the stories of these incredible, often unrecognized heroes, whose actions were no less critical than those of the generals and leaders we revere. Some of them were soldiers, some were civilians, some were leaders in their own right, and others were quietly working behind the scenes. Each one of them deserves to have their story told. So, as we begin this journey, think about this. What makes a hero? Is it their ability to survive the horrors of war? Or is it their willingness to go above and beyond, even if no one ever knows their name? It's time to uncover the stories of those whose bravery and sacrifice have been forgotten by most, but who, in their own ways, changed the course of history. Are you ready to meet the true heroes of World War I? The trenches, those dark, wet, and claustrophobic networks that stretched across the battlefields of World War I were where countless soldiers found themselves locked in a fight for survival. Imagine being stuck in a narrow trench where the stench of decay hung heavy in the air. The sound of gunfire echoed day and night, and the constant threat of death was always looming. But beyond the suffering and the horrors, the trenches were also home to some of the most profound acts of courage that the world rarely remembers. When we think of World War I, we often picture the famous battles like the Somme or Verdun. But behind every battle were the soldiers who fought in them. Men who were sometimes not even given the dignity of a name in history books. These were the ordinary soldiers whose bravery was extraordinary, though largely forgotten. Who were these men, and why don't we hear more about them? They were the ones who survived the brutal conditions of trench warfare enduring hunger, disease, and endless artillery barrages. Many of them were conscripts, swept up by the tides of war, who found themselves thrown into hell on earth, but in the face of unimaginable hardship. They showed what true bravery was made of. Take, for example, the stories of the men who went over the top. It's a term we've all heard, the charge from the safety of the trench into the open field, where machine guns fired relentlessly and death was almost guaranteed. It's hard to imagine the courage required to make that move, knowing it could be your last moment. But these men, without hesitation, climbed the ladders and ran headfirst into certain peril, not for glory or recognition, but because it was their duty, and there were countless others whose names were lost to time. Soldiers who displayed acts of extraordinary bravery without ever receiving medals or accolades. You've probably never heard of Sergeant Henry Tandy, for example, a man who, on the battlefield of the Somme, spared the life of a German soldier. That same soldier, years later, became Adolf Hitler. Could a single act of mercy have changed the course of history? It's a chilling thought. The soldiers of the trenches were not only brave, they were often resourceful, finding ways to survive in the most inhospitable environments. They developed tactics to stay alive, whether that was through constructing elaborate trench systems, creating makeshift weapons, or finding innovative ways to communicate in a war where every second counted. But what is perhaps most poignant about these men is that, even though they were ordinary soldiers, their sacrifices were anything but. They fought, they died, and they often never received the recognition they deserved. Most of these men weren't generals or leaders, they were the ones who followed orders, the ones who did the dirty work, and yet they shaped the outcome of the war in ways that history overlooks. Their bravery wasn't flashy, and their names may not be remembered in grand histories of war, but what they endured and the courage they displayed in doing so was nothing short of heroic. It's easy to focus on the big names, the generals, the strategists, the leaders, but these unknown soldiers, the ones who lived and died in the trenches, were the backbone of the war effort. They fought not for fame or glory, but for survival, and in doing so, they changed the course of history. Their story is the story of resilience, of perseverance against the odds, and of a collective bravery that history too often forgets does so. Who were these men? What was it that drove them to keep going, even when the world around them seemed to be falling apart? And why do their stories remain so hidden, even though their sacrifices helped win the war? In the next chapter, we'll take a deeper dive into the role women played in this global conflict. It's a part of history that's often overlooked, but their contributions were just as vital. Are you ready to discover the untold stories of women at war? When we think about the soldiers of World War I, we often picture men in uniform, marching off to battlefields in distant lands. But what if we told you that behind the lines, there was an army of women whose roles were just as critical to the war effort, though their contributions have been largely forgotten? While the war might have been fought on the front lines by men, it was the women who worked tirelessly behind the scenes, making the impossible possible. Why don't we hear more about them? Why is it that, in the grand narrative of war, their stories are often sidelined, despite their immense impact? When the war broke out, the men who would have filled various roles in society were called to the front, leaving an empty space in everything from factory work to hospitals. The answer? Women. They stepped in to fill the gaps left by the men who had gone off to fight. But these women didn't just take on ordinary jobs, they took on extraordinary challenges, contributing in ways that were pivotal to the war's success. Let's start with the women who served as nurses. Thousands of women volunteered to work in hospitals, some near the front lines, treating the wounded soldiers who returned from battle. But their work wasn't easy. Imagine treating soldiers with limited medical supplies, in overcrowded tents, while bombs exploded just a few miles away. These women, many of whom had never seen war before, became the lifeline to soldiers who would have otherwise perished. Nursing wasn't the only role these women played. Many served as spies, risking their lives to infiltrate enemy lines and gather critical information. They operated under the most dangerous of circumstances, living double lives in order to protect their identities. Women like Mata Hari became infamous for their covert operations, even though history often paints them with an air of mystery or scandal rather than admiration. And then, there were the women who took to the factories. With men at the front, the industrial workforce was in desperate need of reinforcements. Women filled the gaps, working in munitions factories, producing the weapons and ammunition needed for the war effort. Their efforts were so crucial that they became known as munitionettes, working long hours under difficult conditions to ensure that soldiers had the supplies they needed to keep fighting. But perhaps one of the most overlooked Contributions came from the women who supported the war from home. These women worked tirelessly on the home front, raising money, collecting supplies, and encouraging men to enlist. Their sense of duty was no less than that of the men fighting overseas, yet their stories have often been relegated to the background of the larger war narrative. But why do we overlook these women? Was it because their contributions didn't fit the traditional image of war heroes, armed with rifles and leading troops into battle? Perhaps, but their bravery and resourcefulness were just as essential to the war effort. Without these women, the war may have played out very differently. In the aftermath of the war, the contributions of these women were often forgotten, as if their role was only a temporary necessity rather than a vital part of the war machine. But their legacy, though overlooked, is profound. The war changed everything, including women's roles in society. After World War I, women were no longer just seen as caregivers or homemakers. They had proven themselves as warriors in their own right. As we move forward, it's important to remember these women not as mere footnotes in history, but as pioneers who helped shape the course of the war. Their bravery, sacrifice, and determination deserve a place in the larger narrative of World War I. And with that, we turn the page to explore another overlooked group, the colonial troop who fought far from home. Who were they, and why do their stories remain untold? When we talk about the great battles of World War I, we often focus on the Western Front, the muddy trenches of Europe, where millions of soldiers from Britain, France, and Germany fought. But what if we told you that the story of World War I isn't just a European one? What if we told you that soldiers from colonies thousands of miles away were crucial to the war's outcome, even though their stories have largely been erased from history? These were the colonial troop soldiers from Africa, India, the Caribbean, and other parts of the world who fought for their colonial powers, often far from their homelands. But how many of us know their names? How many of us have heard their stories? It's a striking fact. More than 2 million men from Britain's colonies fought in World War I, and yet, the narrative of World War I, as we know it, rarely includes their contributions. Why is that? These soldiers fought alongside European troops, often enduring the same horrors of war, but they were not given the same recognition. Let's take a closer look at the troops from India. For example, over 1 million Indian soldiers served in World War I, making up one of the largest non-European contingents in the war. They fought in the brutal battles of the Western Front, but they were also deployed to other theaters of war, such as the Middle East and Africa. Many of them fought in harsh conditions, facing both the enemy and the intense heat of foreign lands. But despite their significant numbers and contributions, their stories are often lost to history. One of the most significant, yet little known, battles was the Battle of Gallipoli in 1915, where thousands of Indian soldiers fought alongside their British counterparts. The Indian Army's role in this campaign was crucial, but it's largely overshadowed by the infamous loss of life among the Allied forces. These Indian soldiers, some of whom had never seen the ocean before, found themselves in the midst of one of the most brutal campaigns of the war. And then there were the soldiers from Africa. The British and French empires enlisted men from their African colonies to fight in the war, and these soldiers, many of whom were farmers or herders, before the war found themselves in foreign countries, learning to fight in foreign ways. They fought in places like the East African Campaign, where they battled against German forces in the dense jungles of Africa. They fought in the deserts of the Middle East and the trenches of Europe, often under harsh conditions, yet their contributions were largely forgotten, their names rarely mentioned. What makes their stories even more poignant is the fact that many of these soldiers were promised recognition, land, and rewards after the war, promises that were often broken. After the war, many of them returned home to find that they had not been given the respect or rewards they deserved. The colonial troops' stories were relegated to the background. Their contributions seemed as secondary to those of the European soldiers. But why does this history matter? Why should we remember these men, whose names were not etched in the annals of history? Because their sacrifices were no less significant. Without the contributions of the colonial troops, the war might not have been won. These men fought not just for a foreign power, but for a cause that had little to do with them personally. Their loyalty and bravery helped shape the world we live in today, and it's time we acknowledge that. As we continue our journey through the forgotten heroes of World War I, we'll shift our focus to another group often overlooked, the animals who fought alongside humans. In this war, from messenger pigeons to war dogs, these animals played critical roles in the success of military operations. but who remembers their stories? When we think of soldiers in World War I, we tend to imagine men in uniforms, armed with rifles, marching across battlefields. But what if we told you that there was another group of soldiers, one that was just as crucial, yet often forgotten by history? These soldiers didn't wear uniforms, they didn't walk on two legs, and they weren't human. They were dogs. Yes, dogs. World War I saw the deployment of a surprising yet vital force, canines, trained to help soldiers in ways that humans could not. These loyal companions weren't just pets or mascots. They were essential to military operations, carrying out tasks that saved countless lives. Yet, how often do we hear about these heroic animals, whose bravery was as remarkable as that of their human counterparts? From the beginning of the war, dogs were utilized for a variety of crucial roles. Messenger dogs, for example, were trained to carry messages between military units, navigating through the chaos of battlefields, where human couriers would often be at risk of being shot. In a time when communication could mean the difference between life and death, these dogs proved to be indispensable. Imagine this: a messenger dog, running through the mud, dodging explosions, and carrying a message that could save an entire platoon. These dogs were often trained to follow specific paths, even through enemy lines, making them more reliable than any human could have been in such dangerous conditions. They could move swiftly and silently, bringing vital information where it was needed most, without the risk of being detected by the enemy. Asterisk, but it wasn't just communication that these dogs were involved in. They also served as search and rescue animals. In the midst of the horrors of trench warfare, when soldiers were buried alive under the rubble of destroyed buildings, dogs were the ones who could locate them, digging through debris and finding survivors who otherwise would have been lost. These dogs didn't stop there. They also served as sentries, alerting soldiers to enemy movement. In some cases, they even carried supplies, such as food and medical kits, to troops in the most dangerous of locations. But perhaps one of their most touching roles was that of providing comfort. During times of unimaginable stress and fear, soldiers would often turn to their canine companions for a sense of calm in the chaos of war. But what makes the story of these dogs even more remarkable is the bond they formed with their human counterparts. In the trenches, where loneliness and fear could become overwhelming, these dogs were not just tools of war, they were friends. They became symbols of loyalty and companionship in a place where trust was hard to come by. Soldiers would name their dogs, care for them, and rely on them in ways that were sometimes as profound as any human friendship. And yet, after the war, the contributions of these dog soldiers were largely forgotten. There was no grand parade to honor their service, no medals to celebrate their bravery. The stories of these canine heroes, who had fought side by side with their human companions, faded into obscurity. So, why does it matter? Why should we remember the dogs of World War I? Because their courage and loyalty were just as vital as any soldiers. They served in ways that saved lives, brought hope, and provided comfort in the darkest of times. And yet, despite their undeniable contributions, their stories remain largely untold. As we continue our journey through the forgotten heroes of World War I, we'll turn our attention to the sniper soldiers who worked in the shadows, perfecting the deadly art of precision shooting. These men often went unnoticed, yet their impact on the battlefield was profound. But who were they, and why were they so crucial? In the chaos of war, where chaos reigns and the line between life and death is paper thin, there's something unsettlingly quiet about the sniper. These men trained to lie in wait, to remain unseen, were not the loud heroes we often imagine when we think of soldiers. They didn't charge into battle with guns blazing, nor did they lead grand offensives. Instead, they operated in the shadows, their presence often unknown until it was too late. Imagine being a soldier on the battlefield, surrounded by chaos and gunfire, when suddenly a single shot rings out. A comrade falls. You're left wondering, who fired that shot? Where did it come from? That's the power of the sniper, a master of stealth, patience, and precision. But while snipers were crucial to the war effort, their stories remain largely untold. What made snipers so vital? To understand that, we need to think about how warfare was conducted during World War I. The war was primarily fought in the trenches, lines of soldiers dug into the earth, facing each other across a no-man's land. The conditions were brutal, the fighting relentless, and every inch gained came at an enormous cost. Snipers, however, played a crucial role in altering the dynamics of this war. They didn't engage in all-out combat. Instead, they specialized in taking out high-value targets: officers, machine gunners, and other key personnel by firing from hidden positions, often at great distances. A single well-placed shot could change the course of a battle, taking out a commanding officer or a machine gunner and throwing the enemy into disarray. But sniping wasn't just about taking out the enemy, it was about disrupting their operations. Imagine being a soldier in a trench, knowing that there's a sniper out there, watching your every move. The psychological toll is immense. Soldiers had to remain constantly vigilant, knowing that at any moment, a bullet could come from an unseen source. The fear, the tension, it was a constant presence on the battlefield. And it was the snipers who created that atmosphere. But sniping wasn't just about shooting. It was about patience, about blending into the environment, about becoming invisible to the enemy. Snipers would spend hours, sometimes days, hiding in trees, behind rubble, or in makeshift bunkers, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. They would study their targets, wait for the right shot, and then disappear before the enemy could react. And while we may think of snipers as lone wolves, they were often part of a larger strategy. A sniper's role was deeply integrated with the military's larger objectives. They provided vital intelligence about enemy movements, pinpointed weaknesses in enemy lines, and helped disrupt the enemy's coordination. Without them, the battlefield would have looked very different. But who were the snipers of World War I? Some were seasoned marksmen, others were everyday soldiers who had been trained for the role. One of the most famous snipers of the war was Francis Pegumagabo, an indigenous soldier from Canada who became one of the deadliest snipers in history. Pegumagabo's skill was extraordinary. He was credited with over 300 kills, and he survived the war despite the immense dangers of his role. Yet, despite his incredible feats, his name is hardly known outside of military circles. Snipers, like many other heroes of the war, were often overlooked. Their contributions, though crucial, went largely uncelebrated. The quiet, deadly work they did in the shadows was vital to the success of the war effort. But why did these men go unnoticed? Was it because their victories were silent? Because they didn't fit the traditional image of a heroic soldier charging into battle with sword in hand? The story of the sniper is one of subtlety, of mastery over the environment, of precision and patience. They didn't seek glory and they didn't fight for fame. But without them, the course of the war could have been drastically different. Now that we've explored the deadly art of sniping, it's time to shift focus to another group of unsung heroes, the medics. These men and women worked on the front lines, often in the most harrowing of conditions, saving lives while risking their own. Their stories of sacrifice are just as important as any soldiers, yet they too are often forgotten. But what did it take to be a medic in the trenches? What was it like to save lives in the midst of such destruction? In the fog of war, where gunfire rips through the air and explosions shake the earth, it's easy to forget the people who work tirelessly behind the lines, facing death at every turn, yet never hesitating to step forward. These are the medics, the silent warriors who risked their lives to save the wounded, often in conditions that most of us couldn't imagine. In a world consumed by chaos, they were the calm in the storm. Have you ever wondered what it was like to be a medic in the trenches of World War I? To walk through a battlefield where the screams of the injured and the sounds of artillery were constant, yet knowing that every life you saved made a difference? What was it like to patch up soldiers working with limited supplies under enemy fire, with little more than your wits and determination to guide you? The work of a medic was nothing short of heroic. These were the men and women who ran into the heart of danger to pull soldiers from the wreckage, who administered first aid under fire, and who fought against time and exhaustion to save lives. They didn't carry weapons. Their tools were bandages, splints, and antiseptic. But their role was just as vital as that of the soldiers fighting on the front lines. Imagine this, a medic surrounded by wounded soldiers, none of whom can be moved until they've been stabilized. With artillery falling around them, the medic would have to make rapid decisions about who to treat first, who could wait, and who might not make it. Every second counted. The pressure was immense, and the stakes couldn't have been higher. But despite the chaos, these medics remained calm, focused, and determined to save as many lives as they could. Some of these medics were soldiers themselves, drafted into a role that required just as much courage as fighting. Others were volunteers who had no military training, but who chose to serve out of a sense of duty. They came from all walks of life: farmers, doctors, teachers, united by a desire to help those in need. And they didn't just tend to the wounded from their own sides. In many cases, they risked their lives to help enemy soldiers, showing compassion in the middle of war's brutality. One such figure was Lieutenant Colonel John McCrae. a Canadian physician who became famous for his role as a military doctor during the war. While serving on the front lines, McCrae wrote one of the most famous poems of the war, In Flanders Fields, inspired by the soldiers he treated. McCrae's ability to balance his medical duties with his ability to capture the emotional weight of the war is a testament to the inner strength and resilience of the medics. But not all medics received the recognition they deserved. Many served in extreme conditions with limited resources and faced the constant threat of death. Yet their contributions often went unrecognized, and their bravery faded into the background of history. It wasn't uncommon for medics to return home after the war, only to be forgotten by the very people they had risked their lives to save. Why is it that these heroes didn't receive the same level of recognition as the soldiers who fought in the trenches? Was it because their acts of heroism were less visible, performed in the shadows, often under the cover of darkness and without the glory of battle? Or was it because the role of a medic, although essential, didn't fit the traditional image of a war hero? The story of the medics is a story of sacrifice, courage, and quiet resilience. They faced the horrors of war head-on, without the luxury of a weapon to defend themselves. And yet, without them, the death toll would have been even higher. It's time we remember these unsung heroes, not as background characters, but as the backbone of the war effort. As we move forward, we'll shift our focus to the skies above the trenches. The pilots and airmen who fought in the early days of aerial combat were pioneers, often facing death at every turn. Their bravery was just as remarkable as that of the soldiers on the ground, but their stories have often been overshadowed by other narratives. What made them so crucial to the war? And who were the men behind the controls of those fragile flying machines? When most people think of war, they imagine soldiers marching across fields, fighting in trenches, or manning artillery. But what about the men who soared above the battlefields, battling in the skies where the dangers were just as real, but often less seen? The pilots of World War I were pioneers of aerial warfare, facing enemy aircraft in dogfights high above the earth, often with nothing more than rudimentary planes and their wits to guide them. These unsung heroes, who fought in the clouds, have largely been forgotten in the larger narrative of the war. Have you ever wondered what it was like to be a pilot during the early days of aviation? To climb into a fragile, often unreliable aircraft, knowing that your survival depended not only on your skill, but on the strength of the machine you were flying? What was it like to engage in dogfights where every second could be your last, and the enemy could come from any direction? In the early years of World War I, aerial combat was still in its infancy. Airplanes were new, and pilots were considered more like daredevils than soldiers. Yet, as the war progressed, these men would prove that aerial warfare was just as vital as the battles fought on the ground. They played critical roles in reconnaissance, spotting enemy positions, and directing artillery fire, all while evading enemy planes and anti-aircraft fire. The pilots were not just soldiers in the air. They were key to the war's strategic success. One of the most famous pilots of the war was the Red Baron, Manfred von Richthofen, who became a legend due to his incredible skill and the sheer number of kills he racked up. But while he became the face of aerial combat, there were many others whose contributions were just as significant, yet their stories are often forgotten. Men like René Fonck, the French ace who shot down more enemy planes than anyone else in the war, or Edward Manock, a British pilot whose skill in the air saved countless lives, yet who died tragically young. But the role of these pilots wasn't limited to combat. They were also reconnaissance experts, flying high above enemy lines to gather intelligence that would inform key military decisions. Without the information they provided, many of the battles we remember would have been lost before they even began. But why are these pilots often left out of the broader narrative? Perhaps it's because their victories were quieter than those of the soldiers on the ground. Their battles were fought in the skies, out of sight of most, with no massive explosions to capture the imagination. And yet, the pilots' contributions were essential to the outcome of the war. Without them, many of the victories on the ground would never have been possible. What makes their stories even more compelling is the psychological toll of being a pilot. In such a brutal war, the planes were fragile, often prone to malfunction, and every time they took off, they knew that the odds of survival were slim. And unlike soldiers on the ground, the pilots had no trench to hide in. They were exposed, flying through clouds of smoke and enemy fire, where a single shot could bring them down. Despite their bravery and skill, the pilots, like so many others, didn't receive the recognition they deserved. They were seen as daredevils, heroes in the clouds. but often dismissed as secondary to the soldiers on the ground. Yet, their role in the war was just as critical. The skies were as much a battlefield as the trenches, and these men fought for control of it. The legacy of the pilots is one of innovation, courage, and sacrifice. They pushed the boundaries of aviation, becoming pioneers in a field that would shape the future of warfare. Yet their stories remain tucked away in the corners of history, overshadowed by the ground battles that took center stage. As we continue to uncover the forgotten heroes of World War I, we'll next look at a group who worked not on the front lines or in the air, but behind enemy lines, the spies. These covert operatives risked their lives to gather intelligence and sabotage the enemy, all while remaining hidden in plain sight. But who were these individuals, and what motivated them to risk everything in the name of war? In the world of warfare, there's a group of individuals whose work is often invisible, their presence barely detectable, but whose actions can alter the course of history. We often associate spies with the glamour of espionage films, but in reality, the lives of these men and women during World War I were far from glamorous. They operated in the shadows, behind enemy lines, gathering vital intelligence, sabotaging enemy operations, and risking their lives in the process. But how many of us truly understand the immense danger and the critical role spies played in shaping the outcome of the war? Have you ever wondered what it took to be a spy during World War I? To live a double life, constantly walking the fine line between success and capture, knowing that every move could be your last? What was it like to be embedded within enemy territory, gathering information, spreading misinformation, and sabotaging operations, all while maintaining the cover that, if blown, would lead to certain death? The role of spies in World War I was far more significant than we often give them credit for. They weren't just agents of intrigue or master manipulators, they were vital players in the war, often operating with limited resources and facing immense personal risk. These spies infiltrated enemy camps, passed on critical information about troop movements, and even spread propaganda to weaken the morale of opposing forces. One of the most famous spies of the war was Mata Hari, a Dutch dancer who was accused of espionage for Germany. Her story, though often sensationalized, is just one example of the type of individuals who took on the impossible task of working behind enemy lines. But she was not the only one. Many other spies, whose names are largely unknown, worked tirelessly to gather intelligence, often making great personal sacrifices. They were embedded in enemy territory, using every bit of wit and charm to collect information without being detected. But the life of a spy wasn't easy. Spies had to be incredibly resourceful. They couldn't rely on high-tech gadgets like we see in movies. They had to rely on their instincts, their ability to blend into their surroundings, and their knowledge of human behavior. They communicated through secret codes, hidden messages, and even invisible ink. Every step they took had to be calculated, and every decision could be a matter of life or death. The work these spies did was incredibly dangerous. If they were caught, their fate was sealed. They would face brutal interrogation, imprisonment, and often execution. Yet, despite the immense risks, many spies continued to work in secret, knowing that the information they gathered could be the key to turning the tide of the war. What made their work even more remarkable was that, despite their essential role in the war, they were often unsung heroes. While soldiers in the trenches fought visible battles, spies operated in the shadows, their contributions often going unnoticed. They didn't receive medals, fame, or recognition. Their reward was simply the knowledge that their work had helped the war effort, and that was enough for them. But why is it that the contributions of these spies have been largely overlooked? Is it because their work was covert, their success not always immediately visible? Perhaps. Or maybe it's because espionage doesn't fit the traditional image of heroism, a heroic soldier fighting in the trenches or a pilot soaring through the sky. Yet, these spies were just as critical to the outcome of the war as any soldier. As we close the chapter on these silent heroes, we now turn our attention to the legacy of all these unsung figures. The medics, the spies, the colonial troops, and the animals, they all played vital roles in shaping the outcome of World War I. But what is the legacy of these forgotten heroes? How did their actions influence the world we live in today? As we journey through the stories of the forgotten heroes of World War I, those who fought in the trenches, the medics who saved lives, the women who went beyond expectations, the colonial troop who risked everything, and even the brave animals who served alongside soldiers, it's clear that their contributions were vital to the outcome of the war. But as the dust settled and the world moved on from the horrors of the Great War, Many of these heroes were left behind, their sacrifices largely forgotten by the larger narrative of history. Why is it that we remember the names of famous generals, iconic battles, and national leaders, but so often overlook the individuals whose actions were just as critical? Is it because their bravery was quieter, less flashy, or less visible? The stories of these unsung heroes don't fit neatly into the traditional image of what we consider war heroes, yet their actions were just as monumental in shaping the war's outcome. One of the biggest reasons these heroes have been forgotten is that their contributions often didn't fit the mold of traditional heroism. They weren't the ones leading massive charges or making strategic decisions in the war rooms. They were the soldiers in the mud, the medics on the front lines, the spies in the shadows. They did the hard, often grueling work that made victory possible. But they did so without the glory or recognition that came with being a general or a national icon. Yet, the impact of their actions cannot be overstated. Without the colonial troops, who fought far from their homes, the war would have been lost in some of the most critical regions. Without the women who served as nurses, spies, and factory workers, the war effort might have collapsed under the weight of manpower shortages. Without the medics who put themselves in harm's way to save the wounded, the death toll would have been even higher. And without the silent work of snipers, spies, and dog soldiers, many of the key victories on the battlefield would have been unimaginable. So, what is the lasting legacy of these forgotten heroes? It's not just about the battles they fought or the victories they helped achieve. It's about the profound change they brought to the world. The legacy of these unsung heroes is one of resilience, sacrifice, and quiet courage in the face of unimaginable adversity. They taught us that heroism comes in many forms. It's not always about being in the spotlight, it's about doing what needs to be done. Even when no one is watching. After the war, many of these heroes returned home, only to be forgotten. Some were forgotten by their own nations, others were lost to history. But their contributions did not go unnoticed by those who knew them personally. The families, the soldiers who served beside them, and the countless lives they saved, they are the ones who carry their memory. But the time has come for us to remember them, to honor the courage, the selflessness, and the impact they had on the war, on the world, and on each other. It's time to ensure that the stories of these forgotten heroes are told, not just as footnotes in history, but as the central narrative of a war that changed everything. As we look back at the Great War, let's remember that history isn't just about the people who are famous, or the events that are monumental. It's also about the quiet, unseen moments of heroism that make all the difference. The forgotten heroes of World War I may not have had statues built in their honor, but their legacy lives on in the lives they touched, the battles they won, and the world they helped shape. So, the next time you think about World War I, remember that it wasn't just the generals and the famous soldiers who won the war. It was the forgotten heroes, the men, women, and animals whose courage and sacrifices were just as vital to the victory as any of the well-known figures of the war.